So recently I've been exploring action music, orchestral action music for film and TV, trying to sort of accelerate my learning a bit in this area and just build a few more chops when writing in more atonal or dissonant styles of music. What I've found is that I'll often get blocked and not really know how to progress, or it'll be a very slow process trying to get something that sort of feels unified but also feels surprising and kind of atonal in the context of writing action music. And one of the things that I found really helpful, which I mentioned in a previous video, is a course called Film Music Notes by a guy called Mark Richards. And one of the topics that I found really interesting that I wanted to just share some info on is the area of set theory. This is something that I came across in my academic music training, but I'd largely dismissed it because it was associated with early 20th century classical music and contemporary classical music, like Schoenberg, Webern. These were some of the pioneers that used these kinds of concepts. And I wasn't particularly drawn to the sound of that music, but in the context of modern film music and modern media composition, it's actually something that is quite useful. And so I wanted to share some of the basic concepts that I've learned, also as a way of just trying to organize my own thoughts, having recently been learning about this topic. So there are two main forms of set theory notation that I want to cover in this video. One is notation that looks like this. It's a series of numbers enclosed by hairpin brackets, as opposed to this, which is numbers in parentheses. So there's a clear distinction there visually that you can see. And I'm going to go through each of these types of notations, explain what they mean, and then more importantly, explain how you can apply this knowledge to writing modern film score type music or media music, which you want to be a little bit atonal or dissonant, and you want to be able to control that dissonance or the amount of dissonance in a very intentional way, rather than just splashing around on the keyboard, which is what I would always tend to do. So the first type of notation is used to describe specific chord voicings, or you might think of them as little 3-note riffs in this case. So this chord here, we're going to look at the specific intervals between the notes and then describe them using this notation. So what we're going to do is take the bottom of the note and call that 0, and then just count up the semitones. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 0, 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So this would be a 0, 6, 11 chord. Let's do that again. Say I want to describe this. We could describe this as a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this would be a 0, 5, 6 chord. So the important thing here is that we're talking about a specific voicing. In tonal music, if we had a chord like this, and we call that a minor chord, and we invert it, meaning to rearrange the notes, but space them out differently and have them in different octaves, we describe all of these as minor chords. Whereas in set theory, this chord and this chord and this chord, which all contain the same notes, just different octaves, they all have specific individual labels. If we were to use a more conventional music theory way of describing this chord, we might say it's a tritone with a fourth on top. You know, it's these two intervals that describe this spacing of notes. And that would be totally fine. That's basically saying the same thing as this notation here. Where things get a bit more interesting is when we have this type of notation, which uses the parentheses rather than the angled brackets. And this is used for describing families of chords which have the same interval content. Now, we have to be a bit careful when we talk about interval content here, because in the eyes of set theory, intervals can actually be read in either direction, meaning we'd call this a fifth, but in the eyes of set theory, if we do it the other way around, like G to C instead of C to G, in the eyes of set theory, that's actually the same interval. And it kind of makes sense, because if you just think about the sort of sonority of these two bichords, they sound very similar. Similarly, if we take a semitone and we hear that distinctive clash, if we place the F sharp up here instead, or the G flat as it's notated here, If we place that up there, we also get that kind of crunchy clash. So it's a way of sort of saying something about the consonants of the interval, but regardless of the octave. So in the eyes of set theory, this and this and this are all the same. There's one interval which describes them all, and you could describe that as a minor second or a major seventh, I guess. It doesn't really matter. Those two terms are interchangeable. So let's look at another example to really hammer home this point. So if we look at these two notes, you might describe that as a minor sixth. But if we look at it like that, same two notes, just different octaves, we have a major third. And both sound very consonant and quite pleasing. And so, you know, in another way of thinking, it kind of makes sense to think of these as the same interval because they both sound quite sweet. Of course, there's a difference, but set theory just chooses to relate those two things by sort of considering them the same. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because the way that families of chords are categorized relies on this view of intervals. So this family of chords here, represented by this number, if we just play it in the way that we played the previous example, we'll just count from the bottom. So 0, 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gives us this. So you could think of this as kind of like the root form, or the sort of our starting point anyway. So this chord is part of that family, but there's going to be other chords as well that contain the same interval content. So let's look at the interval content of this first of all. We have a minor second, which we've discussed is the same as a major seventh. Then between the next two notes we have a perfect fourth, which we're thinking of as the same as a perfect fifth. And then we have this tritone, which is actually symmetrical, so it's a tritone either way. But of course, this family of chords would also include spacings where you have the two notes like that as well. So we're not going to describe every possible voicing because that would cover the entire range of the keyboard and would take forever, but we're just going to look at the ones that are within a octave. So first of all, we're just going to rearrange the notes in this by doing an inversion in the sense of traditional harmony. You know, if you were to invert a major chord, you just reorder the notes going upwards, say. So we're going to go like this. So that's all the same notes again, but just a different order. Now, if we look at the intervals in this chord, we have a perfect fourth, or we're thinking of that as the same thing as a perfect fifth. We also have a tritone, and then we have a major seventh, which is equivalent to a minor second. So we have all of the same intervals in this new sense of the term present. Then if we go up another step, so we're using the same notes again, just in this spacing, we have our tritone here, then we have our minor second / major seventh, and then we have a fifth on the outside, which is the same as a perfect fourth. So there, straight away, we have three chord clusters, if you like, which all belong to the same family, this family here. But there's a further step, which is a little bit more complicated, which is we need to take these shapes and actually invert them. And if we invert them, then we're going to get another set of chords or shapes. Now, when I say invert this time, I'm not talking about inversions as in like inversions of a major triad. I'm actually talking about like mirroring the chord. So this is something you might vaguely remember from high school when you were studying serialism. If we imagine that there's a kind of horizontal line below the C, like this, and then we're just going to kind of flip the image of the chord, kind of mirror it. So here, if C is our kind of pivot point, we start the shape by going up a minor second, so we're going to go a minor second down instead, and then there's a leap of a fourth, so we're going to do a leap of a fourth on this side as well. So we have this spacing. Now remember, all of this is not tied to any specific pitches, so this is just a way of describing the kind of the shape. So we can put this anywhere we like on the keyboard. It's just got to have this sort of perfect fourth and a minor second kind of spacing. So let's actually put it kind of back where we had this before. We're now going to have this. So that's the same as this, just transposed up. So if we look at our first kind of starting shape, we have this and we have this. Now here I find it quite helpful if you look at the keyboard, because when we invert a shape, but we keep the sort of position on the keyboard the same, it's like we're just kind of like flipping it like that. We can see kind of visually what's going on. We're keeping the outer notes the same, so the outer interval stays the same, but where this crunch was on this side, now it's on this side, so it's literally a mirror image of itself. So I find that's a kind of a faster way to do it, rather than kind of doing it down here and then transposing it up, to just kind of look at the shape and then imagine kind of flipping it. So let's do the same thing on the next step of our set of shapes here. So we're going up to this one, which is the same as that, different order of notes, but the same notes. And we're going to flip this one as well. So I'm going to keep the outer notes the same, and I'm going to look at where this note is in relation to either side. And I can see that here there's an interval of a fourth. So I'm going to try and replicate that interval of a fourth, but on the other side. So a fourth down from the outer note here would be a G. So we get that. So this and this are both parts of this family of chords. They're inversions of one another. Now, what's interesting is here, I think you can really hear that there's something that sounds connected between these two chords. They have a similar feeling, and what you're hearing is the similarity in the intervals, and in this case, a similarity in the spacing. And it means that in the writing process, you know, as I might touch on later on, you've got access to another sound in the same sort of area of the keyboard that you can use to create variety, or you can kind of, you know, create a little pattern. And both of these shapes sort of, their identity is very similar. So again, if we go up to this one and we invert it, it looks like this. So hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing based on the previous examples. And again, like it's nice to know that we can kind of get a similar sort of splash of sound with both of these chords. I just find that in itself is quite a nice takeaway. Like, especially if I want to, say, create some kind of sequence, and I don't want to just say go and then, you know, just map it down the keyboard, say, in a chromatic sequence. If I wanted to vary it slightly, I could go and then go like that rather than like that. I could go and then go, you know, and so there might be a sort of a slightly more dense sound to that, but while staying within the sort of basic sound world that you've established. And so that's it. That's the whole set of voicings, just limiting ourselves to staying within one octave there. We have this, we have this, and we have this. And of course, any of these could be on any note, so you could have this, because these are non-pitch specific shapes. So all of those chords come under this label. And then again, just as a final note, if we had this chord and we were playing with it, and in our arrangement we decided actually we want to have the B up here, we like that kind of sound, that would also be part of this family. Again, just because it has the exact same interval content, thinking of intervals in this slightly different way. I'm just going to do this really quickly for another family or prime form, just so you can kind of get this idea down. So this is going to be the 0, 1, 4. And so our first voicing would be this, which is just playing it as if we were reading it and it was in angled brackets, so that one. Then we're going to invert that, so that looks like that. Then if we go to our next inversion of the kind of root position, it looks like that. So I'm going to then mirror that, and that looks like this. And then if we go again to the next one along, and we mirror that, it looks like that. And of course we can put these anywhere we like. So in this case we've got a major sixth, so we're going to put a major sixth here and then the little crunch on the outside. So when finding these, I'm tending to think of the outside interval first, find that first, and then these are all 0-1-4 chords. Now you might be thinking, after hearing that 0-1-4 and then hearing the 0-1-6 before it, these all kind of sound similar to my ears. What's the point in distinguishing between a 0-1-4 and a 0-1-6? They all just sound like crunchy clusters to me. And that is true. The difference between 0-1-4 and 0-1-6 is quite subtle. And whether or not you care about that depends on what you're trying to do. For example, I could imagine writing a score where I decided this kind of set of notes was being used as a sort of motif. Maybe it's associated with a particular character, and it felt important for me to stay within the sound world of that set of intervals. But granted, it would be only subtly different in some sense to the sound world of a 0-1-6. However, that's just because those two happen to contain crunchy semitones, you know. Whereas if we take a example like 0-2-6, so 0-2-6, that sounds a lot more pleasant. So an inversion of that will be this. And then if we go up to the next position, we have these two voicings. And then if we go up again, we have this. So you can probably hear that these kinds of chords, even when used kind of quite in quite sort of angular motions, have a slightly softer feel to them. And the reason is because the intervals contained here are a major third, a tritone, and a major second, which are just a bit more open and a bit less crunchy. So to take this a step further, if we look at the 0-4-7 chord, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 0-4-7 family of chords is actually, it actually contains a C major chord, okay? And if we invert the C major by the same logic, so here we have a minor third on the, a major third on the bottom and a minor third on the top. If we flip it so we have a minor third on the bottom and a major third on top, we have a C minor chord. So the 0-4-7 set includes all of the major and minor triads, you know, because we can play them anywhere on the keyboard. And so that's all very consonant. If we go up an inversion, or not an inversion, but one step up through our kind of sequence, and we flip this chord, we just get an A minor chord. And then finally, if we go up to here and we flip it, we've got another minor chord, this time a first inversion minor chord. So all minor chord and major chord types, like voicings, are contained within the 0-4-7 set. And so you could say, you know, just in the same way as the 0-1-4 has a certain sound, the 0-4-6 has a certain sound, the sound of the 0-4-7 is the sound of consonants and major and minor kind of sounds, you know. So if you kind of move, even arbitrarily, it's going to sound more consonant and more sort of pleasing in general in terms of the sonorities. And so that's quite interesting, you know, this way of viewing harmony where essentially all minor and major chords are the same. Okay, so now we have to briefly talk about how we would try and figure out what family a particular chord voicing is from. So we're going to go backwards. Let's go back to this one that we started with. It's a 0-6-11. What family of chords does that fit into is the question that I'm trying to answer, so that I can then generalize and maybe use other chords from that same family. So there's a multi-step process which makes this fairly easy. We have to first of all find a spacing of these individual notes that makes all of the notes as close together as they possibly can be. So here's what I've come up with. It contains all of the notes within this tritone interval here. So it's the same notes, different order, but that's as close as you're going to get. And then we look at this chord and we ask ourselves, is it the top of the chord or the bottom of the chord that has the smallest interval? So in this case, it's the top of the chord because we have this interval here. And so, okay, it's the top. So I'm going to count down from the top instead of how we've been doing from the bottom. We're going to call this 0. So this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a 0, 1, 6. And that's the prime form, or it's the name for the family of chords of which this is a part. So let's take another example. This, which is just quite a nice kind of atonal sound. You've got that kind of clashy major 7 on the outside. Let's respace that so they're really close as they can possibly be. So that would be like this. So it's C, E flat, E natural. And again, we've got the clash on the top part of the chord. So I'm going to call that 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's part of the 0, 1, 4 family, which we know includes the inversion of that shape, as well as any permutations of those individual notes and their inversions, and starting on any note you like. So all of those would be 0, 1, 4 chords. Okay, so we've got through the theory bit. Well done for sticking with it. Now let's get into how we would use this, how we would apply this in the context of modern film music or media music, as opposed to in the context of creating perfectly atonal 12-tone music. So to me, there are sort of two broad categories. There are situations in which I'm going to be quite harmonically ambiguous and sort of avoid being pinned down in terms of what the chord is or, you know, where the tonal center is. And that might be the case in more kind of horror, suspense, action type music. And then the other category is where I'm using these kind of shapes and these clusters and these concepts that we've been talking about, but in a more tonal context. So let's talk about our tonal context first. So say we just pick a random shape like this one, say. So that's a 0, 2, 6 in the angled brackets, because that's denoting the specific spacing and voicing. And we're just going to use that as a nice shape in a sort of tonal context. So looking at those notes, it kind of already reminds me of a D7, like a D dominant 7th chord. So I could sort of route my music around kind of D, but then sort of just move the shape, but in parallel. This is called planing technique. So this is a very simple method where you're keeping the bass note mostly the same, and you've chosen a harmonic center, in this case D, and then you're sort of drifting away from it, but then you're kind of returning to it at key moments. As well as just keeping the bass note static, you can be changing chords, and you'll notice that even if you keep the sort of right hand thing the same, in this case I've got a sort of, you know, D again in the bass, but I've chosen this chord as my sort of home, which is a really sort of unsettling D minorish kind of chord because it has F and A in it, but an A flat, which is like a flat 9 or something. And I'm centering my harmony here. If I move the bass note, say, to F, and I play the exact same kind of material in the right hand, it's recontextualized these two notes as sounding a bit like an F7. You know, so there's a kind of a bit of a case for looking and analyzing the notes that you're playing in the right hand, but really the thing that's guiding me most is my ears, like how dissonant does the relationship between the bass and the right hand sound as I'm just kind of playing around with these shapes at the keyboard. So those are the sorts of things that are happening when I'm using one specific voicing as my jumping off point for composition in a tonal context. Now let's have a quick listen to a piece that I composed that's based around the 0611 shape, which we talked about earlier. Okay, and I'll just show you my piano sketch as well, so you can see it really is just one shape. This is the 0611 here, and then I've added some bass notes, and it's just spelling out a melody, and that's all that's happening. In terms of the orchestration, all I've done is just doubled it in the trumpet up the octave at some points, and then I've also put in a horn line to kind of reinforce the main melody. But all of the material from that composition just came from that one idea, just choosing one voicing and playing around with it and putting it in a kind of harmonic context. So now let's hear an example where I sort of am a bit freer in terms of the harmony. I'm not so much thinking about trying to root the music in a particular key center. I'm just sticking to that one shape, again, very religiously, just for example. Deliberately actually avoiding sounding too tonal. I'm trying to create a lot of surprise and a lot of movement and make the piece feel quite unpredictable. But again, just the thing that's creating that sense of cohesiveness is the fact that I've chosen this one specific voicing to work with. So let's have a listen to that. So again, if we just quickly look at the piano sketch, you can see these are the chords here, the specific voicing. They're just jumping around like this. This high sustained chord is doubled down the octave, but then as it sustains, this lower one kind of moves around, creating some clashing. Then eventually we have a different chord altogether that it sort of settles on while this is still going on over the top. And then we have yet another chord, but still built from the same spacing, just superimposed on top. So it sounds like this. At this part of the piece, I wanted it to feel somewhat resolved. So it was really just a case of trying different things and listening to the result, combining different 0611s and thinking, does this have the right amount of closure in this case? This chord at the end. Like there's enough consonants, I guess, in there that to me makes it feel like it's sort of arrived somewhere, but it's still very murky, obviously, and that's deliberate. So in the next example, I took the prime form from which the first voicing was derived, so that's 016, and I just familiarized myself with the different shapes that exist within that set, and then I kind of just allowed myself to use all of those different shapes. And so again, this first example is a more tonal example where, in my head I have quite a clear sense of what the chords are, but not in a very detailed sense, just introducing dissonance through this kind of theory at the framework, which is limiting myself to just these voicings. There's going to be some through line to what I'm doing because I'm using this system. So anyway, let's have a listen. So I should say that the melody in that one was something that I came up with sort of later in the process, after I'd sort of sketched out the harmony and the sort of movements that I wanted and the kind of chords that I wanted going on. The melody is relatively tonal and kind of hummable, and that was a deliberate choice in order to ground the piece a bit more because there's so much dissonance going on. So I haven't followed a sort of strict logic in terms of the relationship of the melody to 016. I've just kind of gone for something that's a bit more accessible to the listener. But yeah, if we have a look at the piano sketch. So yeah, at the beginning we have this idea, which I touched on earlier on, which is the notion of switching between two inversions of the same voicing of a 016. So we have this one, and we have this one. So as you can see, the intervals are the same on the outside, but the location of the crunch is mirrored. That's how we kind of know that they're inversions of one another. And I've just used that as a way of creating a little bit more variety in the intro. So I think these are a bit of planing, but I think also I'm mixing the voicings a bit. Here we've got the tritone there, but here we've got the fourth at the bottom rather than the tritone. So it's hard to say whether or not how conscious I was of that at the time, but anyway, there's some variety in that line. And then this final chord that I've settled on, which is F sharp B, which is another 016. Everything's 016 in this piece. That's in relation to the kind of root note B. That's quite a soft landing. That's quite a consonant chord. It's just like a B open fifth, but with a little bit of crunch around the fifth of the chord there with that F natural. So that was a deliberate choice. And then in the lower part of the harmony, I've done something similar to the intro, where I'm oscillating between two similar voicings, or two inversions of the same voicing, I should say. Except this time it's a bit more spaced out. So here we've got C, B, and then F sharp. And I could have voiced that C, F sharp, B, and then done the kind of trick of switching back and forth between inversions. But it would have sounded a bit too muddy, so I decided to do that up here instead. And it's also a way of me keeping that rhythmic idea going. Bum, 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 bum. Again, it's just another through line that's helping guide the listener and stabilize the music a bit, so that it doesn't get too overwhelmingly dissonant and confusing. So now let's have a listen to a more free example where I'm imagining it as more of an action cue or a suspense cue, and I'm less concerned about being friendly to the listener. I'm just kind of throwing the harmony all over the place, but still with this very strict constraint of using 016 derived chords. So yeah, in this example, the only things that sort of, you could say, departed from the 016 system were these little chromatic decorations here. The notes for the run at the end were around a hexatonic scale, I think. Yeah, that was something that I happen to know fitted well with the 016 family. Basically, hexatonics and octatonics in general tend to be quite a good match for 016 chords. They're very often used in action music, and I know that just from studying this course. And I just thought the sound of the hexatonic, even if there was some clashing going on, because I've really piled on lots of 016s and kind of in some sense lost track of the harmony a bit, I knew that I think this scale does relate to at least one of the main cluster groups, so it's not entirely random. And you can hear a kind of cadence at the end there, so I'm still kind of using my ears to create sort of elements of functional harmony. If you just listen to the very end again. Ba 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 ba, it kind of feels like it settles very distinctly at the end there. Let's just have a listen to my piano sketch and see if there's anything kind of interesting to note. I mean, one thing to say is that I stuck with this idea of jumping between these two 016s for quite a while. It was important, I found, to not change ideas too rapidly, but to give them time to establish. These melody notes here, that's another example of a 016, so I'm using it in a more melodic way there. And then we have some planing just going down, so the same chord voicing just dropping down in a chromatic fashion. I was quite happy with this particular passage. Again, it's just spelling out 016 chords. So the first 3 notes are a 016, then it repeats it up the octave. But then when it continues up the arpeggio, it actually switches the voicing and then does that one up an octave. So if I hadn't switched the voicing, it would have sounded like this, which is fine, and that stays with my 016 idea, but instead I went like this, and then changed the voicing, introducing that F sharp instead, but keeping, because that's also a 016 voicing, to me it sounds kind of unified. Adding some bass notes in here kind of just by ear. Building tension with this kind of notion again. Switching between 2 similar voicings of a 016 and adding some chromaticism as mentioned. This little riff at the bottom is, again, the same sort of thing. These are just 2 016 voicings. Just arpeggiating them. So that's a cool device that just helped me in that moment to create a little motor, a little engine, but again, just without it becoming too stale or too predictable. If I just gone, it would have been fine, but it was just slightly less interesting. With these particular sketches, I took the decision to just develop them as piano sketches first and to spend a good amount of time at that level. And then when it came to putting them out to different orchestral instruments, I was very strict with myself not to play around with the material at that stage. The only thing I did was add a few effects, like percussion, maybe, instead of going ba 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 ba, I'd go dugga 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 dugga, and things like that. The voicings only changed where I changed the octaves or the registers of certain instruments compared with the piano sketch. So that was kind of an interesting exercise for me, and I definitely found that I came up with ideas that I wouldn't have otherwise had, and I was able to write very quickly as well. And I think that was something, if nothing else, that was good to know, is that if I'm kind of wanting to dive into writing more atonally, having a pre-planned system can actually really speed up the process and just give me some kind of wings as I'm just in the trenches actually trying to write stuff and come up with ideas. Hopefully I've convinced you that set theory isn't just a boring, dry academic topic for universities and for classical music nerds, but rather it's something that can help you explore and use dissonances in a controlled and ultimately expressive way that enhances your music and helps you really tune in a high resolution way to the emotion of, say, a film that you're working on or a video game or something like that. So that's everything I know about set theory so far, but as I go deeper into this topic, I'll be sure to do more videos, and do let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. Happy composing, and see you on the next one.